Welcome in, WAPers, where we inch closer day by day to the WAP exam next Thursday. Tonight's topic is the concept of liberalism, and I'm going to sprinkle this in with both social and economic liberalism and take a peek at what that means, and this is definitely one of those topics to be on the lookout for. For social liberalism, we got to start with the Enlightenment. That's really the birth and the dawn of liberalism around the world, and while I did not go into great detail when we covered the Enlightenment about liberalism, the concept of liberalism is promoted, the concept promotes concepts such as egalitarianism. It promotes concepts such as the end of racism, social contract theory, natural rights. Really, a lot of the ideas of the Enlightenment are very heavily embedded in liberalism. But liberalism also believes in the protection of private property, free speech, gender equality. And so wherever you see those concepts being applied in government and in societies, that's essentially liberalism. Liberalism is tied to the Enlightenment. That's the past shapes the future. But as governments were established around the world, if you think of the most liberal societies, you would have to look at Western Europe, and you have to look at the United States especially, is one of the bastions of liberalism. And social liberalism really affected a lot of movements, predominantly the abolition movement. That was a big impact from the Enlightenment and liberalism. But women's rights is unquestionably one of the most important proponents of liberalism, liberal thought or liberalism. Women's rights, as we've talked about in this class, has evolved greatly. And the Enlightenment was one of the first periods of time when women were challenging and calling for more egalitarian and gender equality. Think back to Mary Wollstonecraft and Olympe de Gouges, who we read were great feminists of the 1800s. And under classic liberal thought, there should be gender equality, meaning women have more rights. Now, the truest sense of liberalism for women's rights came after World War I, when many countries were granting women's suffrage, the right to vote. And increasingly from World War I, again, this came on with World War II, women were increasingly becoming more and more active in society. Specifically in the United States, there were strong women's rights movements in the 1950s and 60s. But two breakthrough aspects that promoted women's rights in liberal societies had to do with science and the law. And the science part would be the pill, a medicine that controls the birth cycle of women. And the pill was really important in world history because it was one of the first measures of contraceptives that were being introduced over the counter in drugstores. And that, transformed women's rights in a lot of ways because it provided women with more choice, more liberty in choosing their social experiences. So the contraceptive movement with the pill was really one of the great moments in the women's rights movement. The other aspect would be the legal right to abort. Now this varies per country. Every country's got different abortion laws. But in the United States, the pivotal case was Roe versus Wade in 1973. That granted abortion rights to women in America. And around the world, abortion differs per society. So in many liberal countries, women have the rights to abort pregnancies. And that's, again, a fundamental right that was inspired by some of the classic liberalism and women's rights movements' thoughts. Now, what's interesting is that liberalism has driven many women's rights movements, but don't forget about red feminism, which is interesting because under communism, women's rights also was pushed into society. So as a compare and contrast here, if we ever get a question about liberalism and communism, for example, there is a serious similarity here in that women's rights was promoted in both movements. But I would say that if you're going to get a question on liberalism, some type of question regarding women's rights is highly likely to come up. And so that would be something that I for sure would want to tie right back to liberalism. Other aspects of liberalism socially, just general human rights and protection of civil rights. the American Civil Rights Movement, the end of apartheid, I mean, these all fit the kind of the themes that we've discussed so far that could be examples of liberalism in societies. And I would just say that, again, in general, a question about liberalism comes up, you got to distinguish it socially first and take a look at different aspects of social life, women's rights, civil rights, voting rights. I mean, that's all part of the theme of liberalism, and that society is protecting individual rights. It's promoting elements of free speech and free press, etc. And that's where you get the division with the communist societies, if you have ever had to compare and contrast. Because the communist societies, as we know, steered clear of those themes of liberalism. Another aspect, though, of social liberalism, and this kind of is a bridge to the economic liberalism I want to get into by the end of the discussion, is sort of materialism. And this is a theme tied very closely with liberalism and with capitalism, which is a function of liberalism. The idea that, material possessions are important and that consumer consumption, that's definitely a liberalism concept that began, sort of around the Second Industrial Revolution, mainly because production levels were so much higher than ever before. So goods were being manufactured at rapid paces. The assembly line and all the technological breakthroughs allowed for consumers to have more choice. And materialism, consumption, these are characteristics of the liberalism movement, and that's why in many societies around the globe that reject liberalism, even today, fundamentalist societies, that we were talking about that the other day, liberalism stands opposed to fundamentalism in a lot of ways, as well as it does communism, because it promotes materialism and consumption. So there's a strong rejection of liberalism, not just in communist societies of the past, but also in societies that tend to steer more fundamentalist, including the Islamic states that we talked about, that are governed by fundamentalist governments. So, liberalism kind of butts heads with those two concepts of communism and fundamentalism. But social liberalism, really is about putting into action the Enlightenment principles and seeing how they work in modern times, adjusting for, cultural and societal and technological changes that impact us, all around the world today. But I would say that again, the women's rights movement is probably the one most likely to feature prominently on discussions of liberalism. But another area that liberalism definitely could sneak in is the Moorenomics. Shout out to Mr. Moore, our wonderful economics teacher. The economics section of liberalism. And that, again, ties directly back to Adam Smith and capitalism. So it's interesting that when you look at liberalism as a school of thought, socially it tied to the Enlightenment. And economically, Adam Smith, who was another Enlightenment thinker, there's such a direct parallel running between the Enlightenment and liberalism. Now, economic liberalism, I want to give you some important 20th century economic liberalism terms. You may have learned these in economics here in 8th grade class, but the first is Keynesian economics. John Maynard Keynes was an economist, who in the 1930s, as a result of the Great Depression, published a book about economic theory that would revolutionize the way governments around the world, liberal governments around the world, plan their economies. And we know in communism, right, there's a strong, centrally planned economy. But in liberal societies and in liberal governments, there's free market capitalism. There's often, deregulation of the economy, not as much heavy-handed government influence in the economy. So in liberal societies, Keynes's principles were widely adapted. And one of the most straightforward Keynes principles that you could be likely asked about is how during the Great Depression, Keynes suggested that a lot of governments do the opposite of what was believed to be conventional, which is, even though the economy was floundering, Keynes promoted governments to spend more than it had. And that was really something that Keynes was pushing. He believed that you have to operate what's called under deficit spending. Spend more money than you have. By promoting big spending, Keynes believed that would pump prime the economy, that it would pump the economy up, and in return, that would help eventually lower inflation, create jobs, and the government would eventually stabilize the economy. Now, Keynes's theories were widely controversial at first because it kind of goes against, as I said, a lot of conventional thinking when it comes to the economy. But ultimately, Keynes's ideas were widely supported. for FDR, and the way he handled the American Great Depression, was a strong proponent of John Maynard Keynes. And countries all around the world, especially after World War II, which promoted, Keynesian economics was widely spread during World War II. There's no doubt that Keynesian economics is a central theme with liberal capitalism and liberal economy. However, as we move out of the 1980s and getting into the later part of the 20th century, there was a strong movement away from Keynesian economics. And instead, you start to get an economic theory known as neoliberalism. And neoliberalism is kind of a rejection of Keynesian economics. It's more so, it moves away from the high government spending, and it actually resorts back to laissez-faire economics. Under neoliberalism, there's a strong push for privatization, less government involvement, free trade, and reduction of government spending. So it's moving against Keynes's theory of high spending and high government interaction. Hopefully Coke doesn't sue me here for having the Coke in the YouTube video. Sorry, Coke. But anyways, not to digress. Neoliberalism was highly adopted and widely adopted, especially in Europe. After World War II, the United States has adopted neoliberalism at times. I mean, this is really a concept that flows all over the world, not just in Europe either. South American governments have instituted neoliberalism. China, under the Deng Xiaoping reforms, brought a sense of neoliberalism. So it's kind of the rejection of Keynesian economics. Again, to compare and contrast here with communism, because liberalism, economic liberalism really does reject the idea that communism purported. And one of the reasons communists governments are such in rejection of neoliberalism and Keynesian economics is the belief that this free market economy and this classic capitalism promotes negative effects such as class warfare. The haves and the have-nots. The fact that there's so much wage earning scramble and competition over jobs, creates hostility within the society. Also, again, to tie it back to one of the social effects, consumption, materialism. Those are ideas that were mostly rejected by many communists. And it sets up that division between sort of the West, which are typically Western Europe, the Americas, mostly liberal societies, versus the East, which were mostly communist societies or didn't practice liberalism at all. So, bottom line here, liberalism could be a very highly sought after, I was struggling for the term there, could end up being a highly sought after term for us to have to write about. And that's my number one concern, being able to write about these topics enough. And so I would just say, keep in mind, break things down socially, break things down economically, and hopefully this ATW has helped everyone master the concept of liberalism. What's in store for us on Monday, we're going to talk about environmentalism. I really want to give that a whole day treatment, and so we're going to plan to hit that hard on Monday, and then we have globalization to finish things up on Tuesday and Wednesday, and then Thursday's the big day. So I'm getting more excited by the day. We got our great cram session coming up on Saturday. The lights are out. That means I'm time to go, baby. All right, so you know the drill by now. It's almost the end of the year. Past shapes the future. Whappers, have a great evening, and I'll see you guys shortly.